Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. Welcome back to Home Bible Ministry. My name is Wayne Worry, and today we're going to continue our study of the parables. And in this lesson, which is number 189, by the way, we're going to take an in-depth look at the parable of the vineyard. And it's from this particular parable is in 3 of the 4 Gospels. It's in Matthew chapter 21, verses 33 through 45. It's in Mark 12, verses 1 through 12, and it's in Luke 20, verses 9 through 19. There's slight differences in wording between these 3 parables, but the intent, of the message is the same. All right, and for GPs, I'm going to be leading predominantly from the parable given in Mark, verses 1 through 12. Jesus, remember, was on his trip to Jerusalem. All right, the last parable that we did, the parable of the pounds, was given in Jericho. Well, now he's moved from Jericho, and if you remember, he went from Jericho to the Mount of Olives, and that's where he sent his disciples to bring him the young colt. And from there, Jesus made his triumphal entry into Jerusalem as their king, riding on a colt. And it was there that they cried out, Hosanna, praise to the King. Only 5 days later, they crucified him. All right, but this just happens to be his triumphal entry from the east. Remember, the sun will come from the east. And so he enters Jerusalem from the east. And instead of going to Fort Antony, which was what the Zealots wanted him to do, to kick out the Romans, he went to the temple instead, all right, and kicked out the money changers. And this was another turning point in his ministry. Some of his disciples turned against him. Judas Iscariot turned against him here, all right. He had followed Jesus for 3 years, believing that he was going to be their next king, all right, and that he was going to roust the Romans. But instead, he went into the temple and he kicked out the money changers, showing them that it was not a political thing that he was there for, it was a spiritual thing, So, remember Luke 19, verse 38, saying, "Blessed be the King that cometh in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest." So he enters the temple, throws out the money changers, and then he returns the next day. All right, Mark 11, 27 and 28. "And they come again to Jerusalem, and as he was walking in the temple, there come to him the chief priests and the scribes and the elders, and say unto him, By what authority doest thou these things?" Now, what they were talking about was, of course, all the miracles that he had worked, and all the lessons that he had taught, and all the words that he had spoken, all the claims that he had made. All right, Jesus was quite famous in all the region by now. So they were questioning his authority. So the parable is given to them in response to this question, The parable is to, for, and about them, Again, this is another parable that there is implication to the church, but predominantly it's not about the church. It's about them, the religious leadership. So it's about them, and within the parable they are referred to as the wicked husbandmen. Okay, we'll get to that. But overall, and many refer to this parable as the parable of the wicked husbandman. But overall, the parable is really about the vineyard. Okay, and we'll also get to that. So, beginning in Mark 12, verse 1, and he began to speak to them by parables. A certain man planted a vineyard and set a hedge about it, and digged a place for the wine fat, and built a tower, and let it out to husbandmen, and went into a far country. Now, what we see here are, again, the same building blocks, okay, that we have seen in other parables leading up to it. We've seen these all before, okay? The householder. The householder is God. We saw that in Matthew 13 with the parable of the tares. We saw it in Matthew 20 with the parable of the laborers. We saw it in Luke 16 with the rich man, and in Luke 19 with the nobleman. Okay? The vineyard is Israel. Okay? This is direct from Isaiah 5:7, where God says, "For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel." God often referred to Israel as his vineyard. Why? What does a vineyard do? A vineyard bears fruit from which you make wine. Okay? But we have heard this before also in Matthew 20 in the parable of the laborers, and in Luke 13 the parable of the barren fig tree. So again, all these building blocks, we've heard them before, they've been in parables, and we've discussed them before. The hedge is God's protective hand. That's what's placed around the vineyard. It is his laws and his statutes. It is his presence in the temple. The wine fat. Now the wine fat, that's just Old English for a wine vat, or as in Matthew 21:33, the wine press. That is where the fruit is pressed into the wine. It is Jerusalem, okay? Jerusalem is the walled city. What is a wine vat or a wine press? A wine press was built usually at the bottom of the valley, okay? The vineyards were normally on the sides of the hills, okay? So they could take advantage of the most sunlight, and because it was a lot easier to carry the grapes down the hill than it was to carry them up the hill. Okay? So they would build the wine press at the bottom of the valley. And what they would do is they would dig around, okay? Similar to the same idea as where they treaded out the corn, okay? It would be circular, and they would build a wall around it, so you got this big, huge vat. And then they would throw all the grapes in there, and the women would jump in and stomp them, and the wine would run out, okay? So if you look at this, it's a picture of the city Jerusalem with the wall around it, okay? If you look at it from the top, it kind of resembles a wine vat or a wine press. The tower is the temple, okay? What was the tower? The tower was where the watchman stood to look out over the city or the garrison or whatever he was protecting. That's where the watchmen were, okay? The temple was where the watch was set over his vineyard. And the husbandmen. The husbandmen are the stewards of the covenant, okay? Now, the word husbandry, it means the control or judicious management of resources or domestic affairs. It doesn't only refer to crops, so to speak, okay? even though that's what it does. It's used for. Husbandry is normally used for an agricultural term to deal with orchards or vineyards or animal husbandry. It means the management of those things. But it also means the management or judicial management of domestic affairs. Okay? So what he's talking about here is the priesthood, the Levitical order, the religious leadership. And he went into a far country. Now this is, again, what it means is he left them to govern themselves. He left them to be stewards and to manage his vineyard. This takes place in 1 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 7. Okay? Remember what happened when Israel was first brought into the land. There was no king. Okay? And everybody did what was right in their own eyes. And they went through this cyclic period of apostasy and judgment and crying out to the Lord, and the Lord would send them a judge and he would restore them. And then they'd do it all over again. They'd fall into apostasy and idolatry. Okay? And that would lead to captivity, and then they would cry out to the Lord and he would send them a judge. They did it over and over again, 450 years. So then they wanted a king. Okay, said, we want a king like everybody else has a king. So it's 1 Samuel 8:7, and the Lord said unto Samuel, hearken unto the voice of the people in all that they say unto thee, for they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should reign over them. Okay? And we see this same example in the parable of the pounds in Luke 19:12, and the parable of the talents in Matthew 25:14. All right, where he goes off into a far country and he leaves them to manage his resources as he has told them. All right. Now, verse 1 that we've just covered, Jesus is quoting from Isaiah, the book of Isaiah. Again, this is a reference to the Old Testament. A lot of people want to nullify or discount the Old Testament. You can't do that. The whole thing, the Old and New Testaments together, are God's testament to man. Okay? The only thing that's changed is the covenant. The dispensation has changed. Amen? But Jesus quoted from Isaiah. Okay? Vilifying Isaiah. Isaiah 5:1 and 2. Now I will sing to my well-beloved a song of my beloved touching his vineyard. My well-beloved hath a vineyard in a very fruitful hill. Jerusalem was on a hill. And he fenced it, and gathered out the stones thereof, and planted it with the choicest vine, and built a tower in the midst of it, and also made a winepress therein. And he looked that it should bring forth grapes. Okay? So the Lord did all this work. Right? He built it. He protected it. He put a hedge about it. He built a winepress. He built a tower. He did all this stuff. Then expected fruit. Okay? So the Lord built the nation Israel. He set them up in the promised land. He drove out their enemies from before them. He turned control over their leadership and then expected them to produce fruit for him. Okay? Same thing. Verses 2 through 5. And at the season, right, at the fullness of times, he sent to the husbandman a servant, that he might receive the husbandman from the husbandman of the fruit of the vineyard. And they caught him and beat him and sent him away empty. And again he sent unto them another servant, and at him they cast stones and wounded him in the head, and sent him away shamefully. And again he sent another, and him they killed, and many others, beating some and killing some. So what we're seeing here is the householders' servants, all right? Those that were sent to the husbandmen, okay, to check on their fruitfulness. These are God's prophets. These are the ones that were sent to bear witness of the fruit. This is how God spoke to his people Israel, all right, was through the prophets. Hebrews 1:1 says, God, who at sundry times and divers manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophets. Okay? But they beat them, and they stoned them, and they killed them. Why? Because of their words that they spoke against Israel's disobedience, revealing their fruitlessness. Okay? Israel never bore any fruit for the Lord. Okay? And we'll take this up next time, but just remember that. We'll clarify that more, how Israel never bore any fruit as they were supposed to do. And that's what this parable is all about. Amen? It's about God's vineyard. So we'll take up next time with verse 6 and complete we may not complete it, but we will continue in the parable of the vineyard. So thanks for coming, and we'll see you next time on Home Bible Ministry.